We're reading chapters, or we have read chapters 4 through 8, I believe.
Yes, I hope we have read chapters 4 through 8, because if I did not, then I have severely scorned and procrastinated my homework. And if we read different chapters, then I'll be very lost.
Well, there's always Spark Notes.
There's always Spark Notes. Yeah, I've actually never used Spark Notes. I think back in my day it was Cliff Notes, and I did that once or twice. I also grew up on like the great illustrated classics, like those hardbacks with like a picture on every page, which I recall really loving as a boy. And then as I see my son picking them up and reading through them, I'm all, oh, these are terrible. The writing's just horrid.
I've had similar feelings. I'm like, you're missing so much. Stop.
I know. Like the narrative voice is terrible too. Oh well. At least they're falling in love with books and gaining confidence in reading. So that's something.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Word and Journey podcast. Conversations with friends about stories that shape us and make us think. And some stories that are just for fun. We're busy people reading books in realistic increments. Follow along in the book and join in the conversation. Or just sit back and enjoy. Our aim is to unpack the story and offer you things to ponder. Either way, thanks for being here. Welcome to the Word and Journey podcast, dear friends, late night friends. Here we talk about, well, I was thinking I could call this episode either The Life and Death of Sibyl Vane or Dorian Gray is the Opposite of an Icon, which I guess we'll get into both of those. Word and Journey is conversations with friends about stories that shape us and make us think. And sometimes we have stuff to drink while we're talking, but not tonight. And we're a little sad about that. I'm a little sad about that, but oh well. Anyway, hi Joel, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Moses. I think, can I say what time we're recording, or should we leave that up to the imagination?
We can say.
It's very near 10 p.m.
Yes.
Which is getting late these days for me, but it does make it kind of exciting. I think my part of my creative mind definitely becomes more and more awake as my logical mind shuts down. So I'm hoping that, even though we've admitted this is sans alcohol, will kind of be more loose and free flowing.
I think it could be. I've heard people talk about the difference between night brain and day brain. This is also fun. So I think this is the latest hour that we've done a show at so far. On the other end, the earliest someone has done is for the Wee Web time. I had a friend calling in from Hawaii, and for him it was 5 a.m. So one or more of us are truly heroic for being up before or after our bedtimes. Anyway, jumping into it. So we are here again reading Oscar Wilde's classic, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And we should have read by now. I'm trying to think of that really complicated grammar. May have. Anyway, we read chapters 5 through 8. I can do math. So briefly narrating, if you're following along, you will be familiar with this. And I hope some people are following along. And I'm not just talking into a void, because that would be existentially crisis of sorts. As we left off with the last chapters, Dorian Gray had met or encountered Sibyl Vane. She's an actress, not a very famous actress, but apparently a very talented one, or at least he's very taken with her. And so and then I think, yes, that was it. In chapter 4, we left off where he was determined to marry her. And in chapter 5, we're in Sibyl's point of view in her house, and she's going on and on to her mother about how excited she is about this young Prince Charming who is sweeping her off her feet. Meanwhile, her younger brother, James, is about to be deployed in the army, and he's threatening to kill Dorian if he ever hurts his sister. So that's nice. Chapter 6, we're back with Dorian, and he's going on and on about how wonderful Sibyl is, how she is Juliet and Portia, and all of these wonderful, famous heroines from the stage and the theater, and is very excited about her, but Basil and Lord Henry are saying, don't get married, it's foolish, and foolish to be responsible and virtuous, and all of those sorts of things that they say. But they fail to talk him out of his infatuation. Chapter 7, he talks his friends to going to the theater to see Sibyl and her theatrical genius, but for whatever reason, that particular night, she is terrible. All of her performances are bland and lifeless, and it's a real shock to everyone, including Dorian. Turns out she was doing it on purpose because she had experienced such deep love, feelings, infatuation, something for Dorian that she couldn't bear to act or pretend anymore. So she put out a terrible performance. And Dorian is so angry with her that he dumps her on the spot and then goes home and, important moment, for the first time notices his portrait is changing. Which we could talk about the particulars of the change, but that starts to happen. And he goes to bed rather bothered. And chapter 8, he wakes up feeling repentant and saying, all right, I will go marry her after all, because I don't want to be the evil person that my portrait is turning into. I want to be good. So I will do a good thing and marry this woman because I said I would. But then Lord Henry comes and says, well, Sibyl Vane is dead. Spoiler alert. I'll have to put a spoiler alert thing at the beginning, pre-recorded bonus. So I think it was a suicide. Anyway, and then Dorian and Lord Henry go on dialogue about marriage and women and some, from my sensibilities, some fairly offensive things towards women, but we could jump into that later. But anyway, that is the brief of what has happened in the brief narration. Do you think I missed anything, or are those the high points there?
No, I think you got the gist.
Cool. Yes, jumping into some very complex chapters. What are some of your first impressions or biggest takeaways?
I was excited to see things move forward. I guess we had a lot of like character building up in the first 4 chapters. I was excited to see more characters coming in, making the world come alive. I felt like this book sometimes feels like a lot like just dialogues between 2 characters. Lord Henry being the kind of wordsmith. I guess he's a fop.
He does talk a lot.
Would you agree? He's like a
fop, a
dandy, pleasure-loving guy. But yeah, to see kind of the moral crisis that Dorian has after kind of the big dump, we'll call it. I was like, oh wow, this is really has a lot of it's getting kind of like biblical references, like the fall. I started thinking about what is to gain knowledge in exchange for knowing that sin, I guess. So I thought that was pretty intellectually interesting. I didn't know. I'm excited to talk with you about chapter 5, which is sort of the brother-sister dynamic. And since I've read this book before, I kind of understand it as, kind of setting the plot a little bit. But I'd like to try to unpack, or I'm excited to hear if you have any thoughts about sort of that kind of family dynamic of Sibyl Vane. Her brother is preparing to go to Australia to I guess seek his riches. It's almost like the 3 Little Pigs story where the mom's like, yeah, it's over, like go make your fortunes. And he's like, I'm gonna go to Australia with the criminals and then hopefully come back a millionaire, I guess. Which I don't know if this whole story has a pretty big stress on class and like I guess if you're not at the top, then you're not really doing much.
There's that class struggle, definitely. And something I was noticing here, which I think I noticed in like some of the classic Jane Austen novels. I say that like I've read a lot of them. I've read one and seen like 8,000 versions of another one, because one of Jane Austen's novels has been made into like 8,000 different movie versions. But in like this era, there does seem to be a lot of emphasis on like salvation through marriage, or salvation through like climbing the social ladder, in a sense. And I'm using like salvation small s, more like your route to the good life, I guess, is more what I'm thinking. Like one's goal, one's optimal aim in life is to marry well, to gain wealth and riches, to find one's fortune. And it does seem like there's that idea that Sibyl's brother James has, or certainly she thinks that of him. I guess, I mean, she has this she seems to have this notion that he's just going to like, stroll along in Australia and like find a whole bunch of gold and come back a millionaire just like that, which feels so very fanciful, and it feels very unreal. But I don't know, maybe some people are like that.
Yeah, I think that he sees her as kind of going into this perilous relationship and trying to strike gold. And then I think there's kind of this dichotomy between they're both almost seeking the riches. And you've kind of touched on some of the, views that this narrative kind of portrays for women. And it already has this strong themes of beauty. And Sibyl Vane is definitely, not at most lauded for some acting skill, but other than that, it's pretty much just for being a very beautiful woman.
It's interesting the way Oscar Wilde seems to handle gender is striking. Again, definitely from my sensibilities in my era, looking back in time. The way that in the story, the character James, the brother, regards Sibyl is like he regards her as she's a little bit older, but he seems to see her as more weak, more vulnerable. And even though he's leaving, like he still has this very protective air about him, which seems to present women in a particular way. But a little bit more meta, the way that Oscar Wilde's narrative way seems to handle them. James is presented as this, very stalwart, kind of surly, a little bit brazen, just, tough man who's strong and capable and brave and going off. And Sibyl's portrayed as very silly, very flighty, very insubstantial in a way, just like caught up in all of her feelings, which later we'll see Lord Henry talking about women. And that seems to be kind of how he sees women too, as just like a big bundle of emotions and sensations. So it almost doesn't seem fair to women out of the gate in this story, or the story doesn't seem to portray men and women like in really fair comparison to each other.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The whole story is thus far is pretty much presented in a man's world type of a lens, and even in the discussion of marriage as a value, at least from Lord Henry's point of view, is kind of would ruin Dorian Gray and make him less interesting. I think he says something to the effect, you would have been kind to her, but you would have been like dull and boring.
Yeah, the other thing he says kind of around there, this is when he's on his Lord Henry goes on this whole like misogynist rant, but what does he say? He's like, the only way a woman can reform a man is by boring him so completely that he loses all possible interest in life. Which for Lord Henry, and by extension, but for Dorian, it almost seems like to be bored and dull is like the gravest of crises or the gravest of sins.
One quote that I thought was horrible but also funny was, he says, "Never trust a woman who wears mauve, whatever her age may be, or a woman over 35 who is fond of pink ribbons. It always means that they have a history."
Yes, I love that quote so much when it came up. To be fair, I probably wouldn't trust anyone wearing mauve, but yeah, there were some good ones, some good Oscarisms here. What was another one? Oh, we live in an age that reads too much to be wise and thinks too much to be beautiful. Is something he says. I think that's Lord Henry that says that.
Yeah, I remember that one. I got a good laugh there too.
The other one, I think this was one that came from the chapter with Sibyl and her mother, but the idea that children begin by loving their parents. As they grow older, they judge them. Sometimes they forgive them, which feels ominous, but also very true to life, because I'm like, well, yeah, that was me and my parents. And now I'm like, my kids are old enough to like, shout angry things at me. And I think they mean it in the moment. And I'm able to step back just enough to say, I think you are having 5-year-old passions, and in a few minutes you will be wanting a cuddle and at least a snack. But, it's still quite an intimidating display.
Another thing I found throughout the story that I find really amusing is that when he pokes and prods at America, there's a quote from chapter 6
Yeah.
where he's like, "Marriage is hardly a thing that one can do now and then, Harry." And he says, "Except in America," rejoined Lord Henry. Lord Henry.
That's great. There was an episode of The Nanny that we watched, and that made this like super dating ourselves. But in one episode, I guess Elizabeth Taylor was like the cameo, and she's asking like the main character, who like the main conflict for the main character in that show also is like she's 30 and not married, and oh my gosh, you're 30 and not married, oh my, is kind of the attitude. And so Elizabeth Taylor asks her, "Have you ever been married?" And Fran Fine says, "Nope." And Elizabeth Taylor says, "Not even once?" Which, let he or she who knows laugh a little bit. Joel's laughing, so he knows.
Yeah, I'm laughing at myself,
yeah.
for anyone that's wondering.
Yeah, very much so. Also, yes, I will admit I have seen every episode of The Nanny because it was my wife's idea, but it was a good one because that show is completely hilarious and really smart.
Is it good? You would recommend it? I don't know if I've ever seen an episode.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's like the height of like mid 90s sitcom, like that genre of humor, but it's kind of from that era too, where I mean, when people sometimes talk about this as the era when people knew how to write. It's mostly clean, lots of innuendo, a lot of humor, a lot of sarcasm, a lot of just like witty banter. It's got like a really high like Jewish humor flair, which I really like that. And yeah, and it just the adventures and misadventures of this nanny from Queens who ends up as or just this lady from Queens who ends up being this nanny for this really rich Broadway producer up in Manhattan, and there's a love story involved, and it's fun.
I'll keep that under my hat. I have there's certain sitcoms where I'm like, I've always wanted to go watch through Cheers or something like that, but I never was like, oh yeah, maybe I should check out The Nanny.
You might be impressed and feel very silly about yourself afterward. It's it could be argued it is a waste of time, but it's a really funny one.
I think a lot of that could be said of TV, but you had me at the Jewish flair and sensibility. I also find that usually pretty funny.
At some point, speaking of which, it might be fun to talk more about The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, but we digress very farther, and we're no longer talking about the story we're supposed to be talking about, but that's okay. Other things that came up here. So there's some interesting family dynamics in Sibyl's family, and I would say definitely some interesting dynamics going on between Dorian and Sibyl herself. And I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts about how their relationship goes. They certainly seem very excited about each other, and then both in their own respective ways very devastated when the whole thing ends. Here's where I would draw attention to a difference between like love and infatuation, love and obsession. Dorian especially, there's a very obsessive quality to how he seems to just like wildly idolize her with complete abandon. I don't know. What are some of your other observations here?
Yeah, I picked up on that same. This is just kind of maybe, I mean, beyond infatuation, almost like fantasy. Like it's he. There's lots of references to gods and goddesses and Shakespeare characters, and kind of like he meets her in a playhouse, and like so he's just kind of living out this fantasy of this beautiful woman, and he's really shy about it too. I mean, it takes him a long time to meet her. He doesn't use his real name. That was kind of one of the, or I think it was in a different episode where you were talking about when did cliches start. I had that thought when he's like, my name's Prince Charming. I'm like, in 1890, would this have had the exact same effect as it does now? I'm like, really? That's the best you could do? But it's, yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess. Well, yeah, I guess we probably wouldn't go about saying these characters are wise. Uh, witty and clever and funny, perhaps, but not super wise. I think so thinking about like when the cliches start, I was actually led to think about this idea of like toxic masculinity, which again, very loaded term, very complex and understood in a variety of different ways, and that would be a whole interesting conversation. But with what we conventionally understand to be like a toxic narrative of manhood, sometimes when we look at like, well, where do these narratives start? We'll sometimes refer to society or media or stories, and I kind of feel like this book seems to like offers like some, I don't know, Lord Henry's character in particular seems to really contribute to that. Like the way he goes on about women as just like these bundles of emotions. And I mean, he talks about them. I mean, at one point he's like, yeah, women really appreciate being really, or I wrote down the quote because it was so awful, but he'll say, women appreciate cruelty, downright cruelty, more than anything else. They love being dominated. Which again, to our sensibilities, just seems really horrible. But I guess it's interesting seeing a really prominent character that's like not really portrayed as the villain character. I can tell, as far as I can tell, like he's kind of just like one of the supporting characters, and he's just like spouting all of this stuff about like, you know, women, you know, they're inconvenient, they're emotional, and why would you give yourself to one, and like why would you care about like pleasing them, and just I don't know, there's these really strong like misogynist like overtones that are coming through. And then again, this is, you know, Dorian's mentor who's putting all of this out. So I imagine like that's becoming part of his character also, as maybe influential in why he ends up, you know, dumping Sibyl, because he's been kind of led to this point where he is fully fixated on like his own experience and his own pleasure, and like there seems to be like no room for like being disappointed or being inconvenienced, and everything just has to be like magical and beautiful and prim and proper all the time. But if one tries to be virtuous or tries to be noble, then one is just being like ridiculous also. So anyway, so I see Lord Henry as definitely being this like toxic character who seems to just like consume people. He even seems to consume Dorian in a way too. Like he'll go on and on about like, oh, your youth is amazing and your beauty is amazing and you have so much wit and charm, like all of like the exciting bits of Dorian, but without really making space for when Dorian's feeling sad or lonely or insecure or trying to be like a profound and good person. So I don't know. I think Lord Henry's kind of toxic. What do you think?
I think he's definitely toxic. I don't have it marked exactly in the dialogue. I think it was close to the quote that you started off talking about, where they're like, what do women give? And even just the way that they're kind of talking about women, it's very much from an ownership perspective. And I think they're using like, I think I jotted down, they're using like capital L, like women give men love. I was trying to think about the story from a spiritual type of lens and trying to think about where, because they talk a lot about morals and they talk a lot about virtues, and sometimes Oscar Wilde using like, you know, humanity with a capital H and L with a capital L, like women give men love. But I just really took from that it's, you know, definitely it's a gift to men. At least that's the context that it's presented. And that's even, you know, I think, you know, Basil and Dorian are trying to chime in and being like, but they're good for this. And like Henry kind of barrels his way through and kind of always gets the last word. And I liked what you said about not giving Dorian space for his vulnerabilities. And I think that brings up something I thought about him just having a lack of parents. They reference him having guardians, and like he's he bought like a new sink or something like that, and he's like afraid to tell him about the expense. But he seems to have a pretty emotionally void relationship with his guardians. You may remember that from the past. And maybe in the first few chapters, but I don't really remember kind of how they're his protectors. But he's looking. He has this huge void in his life, and so I think he wants Lord Henry to fill that, and then Lord Henry's wanting to consume him, control him, and then this kind of almost fantasy relationship that's like of very little to no substance with Sibyl Vane, that's mostly existing in his head, and ends because she just has a poor night or doesn't act. And I guess that shows how much substance their relationship has. It was based on her acting, and when she couldn't do that, like he was like, I can't stand you, I never want to see you again.
It seems a version of when we talk about like objectifying people. Like, well, I mean, we'll classically think of, well, when you look at pornography, it's a way of like objectifying a person, dehumanizing them, sexualizing them, which certainly, yes. But there seems to be kind of another way of like depicting that action, or that way of seeing people. Like, yes, Lord Henry steps into the void in Dorian's life left by his parents. Dorian's this kind of aimless, just moldable character who begins to take on features of Lord Henry. He goes to try to consume Sibyl Vane in a sense, and then not seeing her, but rather seeing the characters that she portrays. Ultimately finds, like, when she acts badly and then begins to share some of her heart and her true self and why she did that, like, he just has no interest in like the actual her, because he's so infatuated with her stage presence, which is interesting. I'm making this connection now, and like she has this stage persona that ends up kind of becoming like the real her. Meanwhile, Dorian has this portrait, which I want to talk about the portrait. That there's already been questions about, like, well, who's the real Dorian? Is it the Dorian, or is it the portrait of Dorian?
Yeah, and I think he's figuring that out. Like, is this me? Is this really me? When he discovers the sneer, should we call it a sneer? After
yeah, we could call it the sneer.
Yeah, the curling lip, cruel curled lip.
Yeah, the cruel sneer.
I did want to call out. I didn't have any quotation to read that, but I really enjoyed the writing in his kind of midnight walk after leaving the theater. Kind of watching the sun come up, watching the people set up the market and carry the apples. I don't know what I could pull out from there, but sort of this new dawn, I guess, and reckoning, kind of at the end of his innocence, I guess you could say.
I remember that. I really enjoyed that passage as well. Yes, it was really, really beautiful writing, a little bit more poetic, and yeah, signifying this really great transition moment. I think the other long stretch of quote that I noted it. I'm not going to read it because it's a little bit longer, and it's not really like the kind of content I want to celebrate a whole bunch. But it's, again, another one of Lord Henry's rants on just him being a misogynist and seeing women in this really terrible way. There's kind of a way, I guess we can maybe start segueing into like talking around the portrait. So Lord Henry's approach seems to be really cheapening human life. Like, he'll talk about Sibyl Vane's death, which, when we look at it, I don't know. I look at it as this was, in a way, like kind of like the Juliet death. It's this moment of passion and impulse. It's really irrational choice made out of passion and obsession. Totally like, a very unhealthy, unmindful sort of thing. But Lord Henry won't see that because he won't see the person or the pain. He'll just say like, oh, wow, what a really sweet romantic gesture. She must have really loved you. I wish somebody would have loved me enough to kill themselves for me. And again, like completely missing like the actual person, and like not really seeing like the tragedy of it, or not letting himself see the tragedy of, here was like a brokenhearted person, but also a person who opted to kill themselves. He's just like, oh, wow, the novelty of it, or the experience of it, or you consider yourself lucky, Dorian, that a woman would kill herself for you because she loves you just that much, because you're just so fine and dandy, aren't you? And like, I never had anyone kill themselves for me, so I don't know. He's just terrible. He's just terrible.
Yeah, I feel like that was definitely an emerging theme. You kind of talked about Lord Henry being not like the villain, but I feel like when he comes in to Dorian's room after he slept into 115 or whatever it is, and they reveals, that Sibyl Vane has killed herself, and he's sure that it's not an accident. He's kind of like already figured out everything, and he's come with a plan for Dorian to like, keep him out of the newspapers. And, like his first thought is not to be like comfort him or, show him sympathy or compassion or like, let him, vent his emotions, but rather to be like, well, your big unveil to public society should not be a scandal. So like I got this all worked out. And so like these are the things that Lord Henry values, is popularity and just making it from one event to the next. And it's like, oh yeah, I got like box seats all lined up, ready to go to dinner. Like she died for you. It's like, it's really messed up.
It's messed up. I mean, for sure, from our sensibilities. But I mean, he's also internally consistent. I mean, if he's saying, yeah, like all that matters is youth and beauty, and that's the epitome of existence, then like, I mean, everything he does is kind of supporting this idea like, well, Dorian, you're young and beautiful, so live it up. And don't get bogged down by other people's feelings, even if they're your fault, because that would just be damn inconvenient. Which I feel offended by that, but at the same time, it's like, well, I mean, it's a really well written character, and like so far, like I mean, he's at least consistent with himself. So
I can't disagree with that. And he usually gets all the witty good lines.
He does. Yeah, Dorian just kind of like, falls back on the couch and swoons, and Lord Henry has all of these great one-liners, and Basil's just over in the corner brooding. Let's talk about the portrait a little bit and the significance of that and what's going on there. So how it was portrayed in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which had kind of made use of the Dorian Gray character in this sort of Victorian era Justice League sort of movie, which I'm curious about now, but it might actually shock me in how terrible it was, because sometimes there were terrible movies. But the twist in that one was that the portrait aged and Dorian didn't, and if he ever saw it, then he would die right away. The way that it's presented in the book, though, is I'm finding much more complex than that. It's not just aging, or I mean, perhaps we'll see that as we go. But it's taking on his burdens, taking on his sins. Like we noted, he first notices it as just this really subtle, like the mouth has become a sneer, and he's not made ugly because of age as much as like the darkness in the soul. That, like, we could say like the taint of the sin of betraying Sibyl Vane and like leading her to her death doesn't show up on the person, but it shows up on the portrait, which feels much more complex. What are some of your impressions of what's going on here, or what does this symbolize?
Yeah, I think it's the portrait. He starts to realize that it's, a mirror of his soul. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but the way I thought of it was kind of Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, and not just like kind of their decision. And I'm not, I was thinking, to be honest, of Lord Henry as almost being kind of like the sweet talker, or the deceiver, or like the serpent type character, which I think he is. But the part that really made me think of that biblical story is that they're barred from the garden to come back in. And Dorian Gray kind of has this, or in his mind, like a new epiphany that he's going to win her back and apologize. And, he writes, he goes and he's going to right the wrong. There's a quote that I like that I underlined here, that he goes, when we blame ourselves, we feel that no one else has a right to blame us. It is the confession, not the priest, that gives us the absolution. When Dorian had finished his letter, he felt that he had been forgiven, and he's kind of in his more innocent way, like feeling like, I don't know, he's like claiming that he's nothing wrong, and then he finds out that in fact Sibyl Vane has killed herself. There is not going to be going back, and I think he's crushed, and all he can think about is that death for a little while, and the portrait is there. I think it's still, is it still covered by the he still has it covered at that time, since he looked at it like late into the night. Do you remember that?
I think he mostly kept it covered. He might have looked at it one more time.
Yeah. So he's just kind of this reckoning, and then how quickly he's at a loss. And then again, in my reading, that almost like parental or structural void, Lord Henry is there to be like, well, she died for you. It's not something you need to redeem, that it was done for you. And I think he kind of knows that it's wrong, and it's like almost like that's kind of his fall from grace, and then also accepting that there's no going back, maybe. And I think I didn't note this, but there might be some little point where he has in his own thought where he's like, well, I'm going to use this as this is going to help me. Like, I'm always going to use this little curled smile sneer from the portrait to help me not get worse. And then almost, I felt like at the end of the chapter, he's like, well, I guess maybe it doesn't even really matter. Like, I'm going to look beautiful forever. So I guess I'll just let this portrait keep my sins for me.
I love that. I love these connections you're making, and like referencing like the Garden of Eden narrative. I think it is St. Paul, but definitely one of the New Testament writers will talk about how being by Adam's sin entered the world, and or my goodness, I'm going to misquote the Bible. Sorry, but it's like sin and death entered through Adam's actions, and that's those put into action through their expulsion from paradise. And you could almost say through, or wait, I'm having a total Bible college fail. Was it through Adam death entered the world? Or somebody look up the verse. Somebody out there knows what verse I'm talking about. But I think you're right. I mean, you kind of see that in Dorian, and what Dorian does in his actions, like death enters through Sibyl's death, and it does it keeps him from true redemption in a way. There's no way for him to really become good again. All he can do is hide his badness. And yeah, the way you're talking about it, I mean, he's talking like an addict, really, like, or somebody who's got this bond with a drug or with some other really toxic behavior. That you sometimes hear folks like this. They'll talk about like, well, here's a failure. I'm going to motivate myself. I'm just going to self-motivate. And I'm going to have my internal managers and resolves come out in force, and I'm gonna be better, and I'm full of resolve, and or I'll just shift into plain denial. I'll be like, well, I'm happy and I'm beautiful, and screw everyone else, and all of these elaborate thought structures to just like not feel or to not face up to responsibility. Dorian's situation gives him this really vivid opportunity to like not face up to his stuff. He doesn't have to take responsibility for his sins or for his actions because the portrait's going to carry them. So, wow, good for him.
I think he even says, I'm going to go grow a field of poppies or something like that.
Yeah.
Am I mistaken there? I was thinking that he was like, I'm going to start making my opium. That's how I read it, but I might have gotten that reference wrong.
Oh, okay. I wasn't quite sure. So I was wondering about that, though. I mean, like, why else would someone grow a field of poppies? Poppy seed muffins, maybe, but but this book also predates Costco.
Did you just make a muffin joke?
I think I made a muffin joke. So to the listener, I mean, if y'all can think of like a legitimate reason other than opium to grow a field of poppies, let me know, because I might be interested a little bit. Not really. But
on the drug theme that you're talking about, I think he's like, there'll always be opiates for that, my dear. Or like Henry's like, don't worry, like, he's basically saying my addiction through, seeking pleasure almost overrides pleasure itself. Like you probably won't even need opiates because like, just come with me or whatever.
Yeah, Lord Henry's approach to life and struggles is just stunning, and it's just stunning. There's a very famous textbook within like the drug and alcohol education world called Uppers, Downers, All Arounders. There's like 7 or 8 editions, and they're all really great. But there's a quote in one of the versions, something to the effect of, "People have a fundamental need," or something like, "People have a fundamental need to alter their existence," or something, or a fundamental, or a never-ending drive to alter their existence, or something. Which I'm thinking of here, and especially in how like Lord Henry and now his pupil Dorian seems to approach it, the sense of, yeah, I don't want to feel, or I want to be in an altered or elevated or heightened state all of the time. And in a sense, this seems to be part of how they view women too, is again not attachment figures, but novelties. We could maybe interpret them as saying or believing a woman is only as good as the novel experience that she gives you. And if she gives that through marriage, cool. Through her death, cool. Through, a good apple pie, cool. Which again is just like horribly reductionistic and objectifying, and not actually conducive to healthy relationships, in case anyone was wondering. Some of their thought structures and the way they interact with emotions and pain and suffering seems very typical of somebody who's like in active addiction. And again, for me, when I think of what addiction is, it's much more than just I drink too much, or I smoke too much, or I use opiates. I have obsessive relationships with whatever I'm obsessing over, whether that's drugs or sex or food or entertainment or my own beauty or something. People tend to bond strongly to things that are bad for them, because they're bonding to something that will alleviate stress or alter their reality or something. I categorize all of that under addiction.
I just wanted to call out, I think it's probably from your 1984 series that really hit home for me, and I think it was you that said it, is that along in that series of addiction, it's not necessarily how many times you might drink or do opiates, but also the time you spent obsessing about that, or the energy that you give. When I heard that kind of had like a light bulb go off in my head, and just thinking about attachments in general, some healthy, some not, but like in dealing with addiction. And I was like, wow, that's like, maybe you only drink once a year, but you like obsess about it. Is that really that much different? In certain ways, if you're giving that much energy, or you spend that much energy like planning your life around it to make that happen, or whatever it is.
Yeah. In some sense, we could say that person is not truly sober because they haven't really detached from the thing. They're just not using it. So the other really interesting thing I was thinking about, like Dorian in his portrait, is, like we said, there's this question that's raised in like I think chapter 2, or whenever the portrait is finished. The portrait is called the real Dorian, because like Dorian and his portrait are just so closely connected in what it is. But as he's watching his portrait change and take on his sins and his burdens, what it was reminding me in an inverse sort of way was icons. And again, here in Orthodox Christian practice, veneration of icons is a really important part of our practice. There's a lot that goes into it. And it's not just, oh, pretty picture. And it's not like worship of people. But we'd say the icon, it's a holy image. It depicts the fullness of a person, or the glorified version of them. Part of why we venerate a person as a saint is we recognize that they achieved a level of holiness that is very substantial while still living. That is only possible through the grace of God. And so we say we look through the lens of the wood and paint to the actual person who we believe is resurrected. And then we are looking through the lens of the actual person to the God who gave them grace to become all that they are. And so in that sense, we when we look at an icon, we say we're looking at like the glorified fullness of who it is that's depicted. And that's part of like how an icon's written. And then so here the inverse. So Dorian's portrait, Dorian's like anti-icon in a sense, is beginning to take on his sins and his burdens. And in a sense, like, I almost want to say, like, the essence of Dorian is his sins, because that's what's being put in the icon. Okay, so this metaphor may break down. You can let me know. But whereas like a holy icon would like depict, here's the grace of a person, the holiness, like the good, the best of a person being depicted. Dorian's portrait seems to be doing the opposite and saying, no, here's the worst of you that we're holding, and we're immortalizing your sins and your burdens and all of that, which just, I don't know, kind of turns the icon concept on its head in this really like dismal, kind of scary sort of way. And I don't quite know where to go with that or where that's going, but that was my initial thought.
No, I like the metaphor. I would just say my take on what you just said is that the sins that are starting to appear as his face change isn't necessarily black and white yet. That the portrait isn't quite the essence, but it's certainly not as perfect as it was. But I mean, to your point, I guess I'm thinking on the spot here, but Dorian can only see, it's at a point where Dorian can only maybe notice the difference. Like if he was to show it to his butler, maybe he wouldn't, oh, the nice portrait of you, but like he can see it. I like it. The anti-icon.
The anti-icon, yeah. Or I guess part of what like the curse of sin or what like the condemnation would be. In Orthodox practice, we have this really beautiful way of saying like, like this person's been cleansed and redeemed, and they've been able to kind of like shed their wood, hay, and stubble parts and become like pure gold, pure fire. But like kind of like the inverse is happening, where like no, like Dorian's darkest parts are what's being immortalized. And I mean, goodness, what a way to be cursed. He gets to keep his good looks and like go about doing whatever, but like the actual thing that's being immortalized is like everything bad about him. I don't know that I'd want that life.
Doesn't seem like a good trade.
No, yeah, definitely not. I mean, yeah, doesn't seem so good. So that's where we've come in the story so far. Sibyl Vane is dead, and the portrait is corrupting, and Basil is still brooding, and Lord Henry is high on his own self. And I guess James is in Australia for now. Maybe he'll come back. He seemed kind of significant. I'm guessing he's being foreshadowed in some way.
I don't know if I had much more to add. I didn't quite get ready to talk about it, but maybe foreshadowing for another episode is I'm really interested in the Shakespearean reference to Caliban, both in this chapter and in the initial one. And I've, as someone not that familiar with The Tempest, I've been kind of watching some YouTube videos on Caliban and The Tempest and trying to figure out how this kind of metaphor ties back into this portrait. And I think it has a lot to do with slavery and into sort of like accepting, but and sort of the betrayal of the betrayer. So I'm that's kind of where I'm at. I kind of was hoping to have something more to say this episode, but I guess that's for something for people to think about. Wish that I was more up on my Shakespeare than I am. I feel as a writer I should know the Bible, which I'm like pretty good on. Greek myth, just started kind of working on that this year. And then Shakespeare, probably I'd give myself like a D, maybe even an F. Actually, probably F.
Oh, goodness.
For really knowing, I mean, I know who Romeo and Juliet are, so.
Okay, so maybe not a total F.
Well, there's a lot of Shakespeare, I think.
There is, yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting reference. I don't know fully what to make of that either, but it does seem like it's significant. So maybe we'll just have to have a sequel where we talk about The Tempest. Because I think I've seen that play. I saw the play once when I was a teenager and kind of know who Caliban is, but there's so much about the play I don't remember. So I think it might be good for us to read some Shakespearean form. That's a teaser for the listener, a teaser which will come to pass at an unspecified time in the future. Probably. Maybe.
I think so.
that then will be our conversation for the night. We'll come back reading chapters 9 through 12 and see what other sort of Mishigas, Dorian, and Lord Henry get themselves into this time. And I guess we'll see who else dies. But yes, thank you for listening. Please do visit our Patreon page, leave us reviews, share this around, and read some books, read some good poems, and find your favorite book and introduce it to a friend. Amen.
Amen.
Word and Journey is a podcast by Moses Bernabe. If you like what you hear, consider supporting the show with dollars, reviews, or shares, or all of the above. Word and Journey can be found on most major podcast platforms and on my author Patreon at patreon.com/Moses Bernabe. Moses Bernabe can be found at mosesbernabe.com. Contact info for my most excellent co-hosts can be found in the liner notes. The podcast logo was designed by TJ Todd with additional development by Moses Bernabe. The theme music is by Aaron Esparza. This episode was mastered by Breakfast Puppies. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.